In the final days of the Second World War, inside of the black heart of the Third Reich, there was intense and brutal fighting in every street of Berlin. Berlin was the capital of Hitler's empire, and as the Soviet Red Army approached, the dictator made a decision to remain and die inside of his bunker. But there was a huge threat that faced many of the civilians inside of the capital. Specifically, women were in a lot of danger. There had been many terrifying and barbaric stories told to the civilians of Berlin about the actions and brutality of the Red Army, and it had been claimed that there was an onslaught of evil heading to the city. But the women of Berlin faced assault on a huge scale, and terror was brought to their doors. Despite surviving the bombardment from the artillery, when the Soviet soldiers came in, the women became targets. It was on Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday that the dictator left his subterranean lair, which was known as the Führer bunker. This was the last headquarters, and he had been inside here for months since the January of 1945. But on the 20th of April, the exact day of Hitler's birthday, he made a final trip to the surface to award Iron Cross medals to a number of children, some as young as 10, who had been defending Berlin. But on that very day, the artillery bombardment began of Berlin, and the Soviet Red Army sent him a birthday present in the form of 100-ton of bombs crashing down on Hitler's capital. 10 days later, the body of Adolf Hitler was left smouldering inside of the Reich Chancellery Garden and was reduced to a small collection of remains. It was the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, who was also the local leader within Berlin, who had the most influence with regards to the actions of the people in the city. Goebbels continued to make a number of radio broadcasts, and he called upon as many people as possible to try and rise up. There were everyday people and children who were equipped with projectile missiles and other weapons to try and destroy Soviet tanks. And there was already intense terror in the city. Some knew the war was over and decided to die by their own hands, but the Red Army would reduce Berlin to rubble, and the soldiers there were known for their brutality. One man who was inside of the city, a Soviet soldier, claimed that on the walls of the houses we saw Goebbels' appeals hurriedly scrawled in white paint. Every German will defend his capital. We shall stop the red hordes at the walls of our Berlin. Just try and stop them. Steel pillboxes, barricades, mines, traps, suicide squads with grenades clutched in their hands. All are swept aside before the tidal wave. Drizzling rain began to fall. Near Bisdorf I saw batteries preparing to open fire. What are the targets? I asked the battery commander. Centre of Berlin, Spree bridges and the Northern and Stretton railway stations, he answered. Then came the tremendous words of command. Open fire on the capital of fascist Germany. I noted the time. It was exactly 8:30 a.m. on the 22nd of April. 96 shells fell in the centre of Berlin in the course of a few minutes. The bombardment was ruthless, but what was equally as terrifying was the behaviour of the soldiers storming the city and how they treated women. In the Pacific during the war, many women had been subjected to terrifying ordeals at the hands of invading Japanese troops, but what happened inside of Berlin at the hands of the Soviets was disturbing and shocking. The Red Army had specifically issued orders for their soldiers to direct their anger towards the enemy, as in those men who were fighting them regardless of whether they were in uniform or not. This led to scores of men being mown down, many even when they were surrendering. But during the earlier German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans stormed into different eastern lands and rounded up many women and had them shot in huge pits on the edge of their hometowns. Many of these victims were even forced to dig their own graves, and the children were even sent into these death pits. Because of this, many Soviet soldiers believed they had a divine right for retribution, and that they had a right to take the fight to civilians and women, and they thought they could do whatever they wanted. The women of Berlin especially, as they were in the heart of Hitler's empire, were seen almost as a trophy of war, and they were seen as treasure or the spoils of war which could be taken with whatever might they had. It was claimed that the Soviet soldiers began assaulting every German female, from 8 to 80. They did not discriminate based on age. Many of these women were defenseless, and their husbands, boyfriends, or brothers had been sent to fight against the Soviets inside of Berlin. One woman claimed that inside of Berlin, the next morning, we women proceeded to make ourselves look as unattractive as possible to the Soviets by smearing our faces with coal dust and covering our heads with old rags, our makeup from the Ivan. We huddled together in the central part of the basement, shaking with fear, while some peeked through the low basement window to see what was happening on the Soviet-controlled street. We felt paralysed by the sight of these husky Mongolians, looking wild and frightening. At the ruin across the street from us, the first Soviet orders were posted, including a curfew. Suddenly there was a shattering noise outside. Horrified, we watched the Soviets demolish the corner grocery store and throw its contents, shelving and furniture out onto the street. The Red Army were causing terror across the city, and another woman said, "The front-line Russian troops who did the fighting, as a woman, you didn't have to be afraid of them. They shot every man they saw, every old man and young boys. But they left the women alone. It was the one who came afterwards, the second echelon, who were the worst. They did all the assaulting and plundering. They stripped homes of every single possession, right down to the toilets." To make things worse, many of the Soviet soldiers who entered Berlin were drinking very heavily, and many were battle-scarred, and they justified what they did as revenge and punishment for the Nazis and the Germans. Of course, their actions towards women were war crimes, and these were defenseless women. One Soviet general described what was happening, and he said, "The captured German female cats declared they were avenging their dead husbands. They must be destroyed without mercy. Our soldiers suggested stabbing them, but I would just execute them. So those who were caught trying to take up arms against them were shot and killed or executed in other ways." And the same man claimed that, with horror on their faces, the women had told me what happened on the first night of the Red Army's arrival. Every single evening that the city was under siege, fire, and then occupation, the danger was very real for the women of Berlin. In one part of the city, the soldiers raided an orphanage and a home for women who had just given birth, who were just about to give birth. This home was run by Catholic nuns, overseen by a Mother Superior. The Soviet officers burst in and they treated the women with respect, and they warned the women to flee and that the next wave of soldiers would be the worst. This is what happened, and young women and old, as well as those who were pregnant, who had given birth, were subjected to terrifying ordeals. There were women who were hiding inside of air raid shelters, and the Soviets ripped these women from their safety. Hitler's cook, who managed to flee the bunker in the final days of battle, disappeared as she was led into an underground station by 2 Soviet soldiers. She was never seen again, presumably killed after being subjected to a brutal and horrific ordeal, and her fate still remains lost. Lots of these women were subjected to violent beatings and ordeals, and many were beaten black and blue. They tried to do whatever they could to escape the punishment, and one 24-year-old actress even became the boyfriend of a Soviet soldier. However, this went very bad for her when she was taken back to the barracks to meet the other soldiers. The Red Army were hunting in certain evening hours within Berlin for women, especially after they had drank heavily, and in the ruins of Berlin many women hid in cellars and in the bombed-out buildings, even whilst artillery was crashing around, as they knew what would await them if they were captured. Now, despite the Battle of Berlin being considered a huge victory for the Red Army, and something that brought an end to the Second World War in Europe, the fate of women of the battle is often forgotten. They were subjected to evil at the hands of the advancing Soviet soldiers, and there were roughly 10,000 women who died from the actions of the Soviet men towards them, and there were hundreds of thousands of incidents of assault all over the city. The people of Berlin soon learnt that much of the stories they had been told about the brutality of the Red Army was correct, and they then had to live with the barbarism. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.